Renegade thinkers. Let's talk about brand and its vast power. Great brands are worth more, often billions more than their lesser known generic brethren. The power of brand is vast. It impacts employees, why they started working with the company, why they stay, and why they become brand ambassadors. It impacts customers, why they come to you, why they stay with you, and why they might even refer you to others. And yet, while I'm saying this, brand is still a fluffy word, and brand is not a welcome word in many boardrooms in many companies across the country. It's incredible to me. We've moved into, obviously, the market. It's a tough market right now, and it's probably not going to get any easier in 2021. So every CEO is focused on their quarterly earnings, and it's about revenue. It's about net new logos. It's about pipeline. I get it. You got to drive your business forward. But to think that brand and demand are not interconnected is folly. To think that you as an organization can succeed as effectively without brand is folly. And I know it's wartime, and I've used this analogy a couple of times. That there's something called a wartime CEO versus a peacetime CEO. Peacetime CEO is the one who's in a growing market, and so your investments and your notions change. So the wartime CEO right now is saying, I've got to reserve capital. I've got to give myself flexibility. And so I think wartime CMOs are doing the same thing. They're keeping their powder dry, waiting for opportunities. They might be outsourcing more. All of that is fine. I get it. That's really smart. That's what a wartime CMO needs to do. But to think a wartime CMO just says, we don't need brand, to me is problematic and more than just short-sighted. You're really not probably hurting your organization. All right, now where's this going and why is this such an interesting podcast? Imagine for a moment you're a really well-known brand, like say IBM Watson Marketing. You're really well-known. Everybody knows you. There's nobody listening to this show who hasn't heard of IBM and hasn't heard of Watson. I mean, those are two of the most ubiquitous marketing, well-known things, if you will, brands in the world. Now, spin those out of IBM, and you have a brand new company called Acoustic. And the CMO of that company is Norman Guadagno, and he's here as a guest today. And we're going to talk about what it means when suddenly you don't have big brand anymore. So Norman, welcome to the show for the second time.
It is a pleasure to be back, Drew. And that was quite a great introduction as well. You sort of nailed it with the description of the challenges I and our company Acoustic face, and frankly, the bigger landscape as well. So I'm eager to dive into this with you.
Well, thank you. And by the way, I'm certain I butchered your last name, as even though I know how to pronounce it. Would you just correct the record for me?
I am always happy to. It's Guadagno. It just
Guadagno,
flows right off the
see?
tongue.
Guadagno, it's easy, but it's, I think I told you this. I become my father. Now I'm butchering words that I knew how to pronounce. So anyway, so let's set the stage here, dial back a little bit. How long has Acoustic been Acoustic?
Yeah, so you got to turn the dial back to July of 2019. That's when Acoustic was born. We are a carve-out from IBM, as you mentioned. So there were a number of different capabilities inside IBM Watson Marketing for a number of different reasons. Really wasn't the best fit for where IBM is going. So that was all packaged up and purchased by private equity. And the new company was born, as I said, in July of 2019. I joined in September of 2019. So just been a little bit over a year now, just had my 1-year anniversary. And, fortunately, it's been a year when there's been no challenges in the marketplace whatsoever. So
exactly. This is easy peasy time. I mean, what's so amazing is we can probably divide up your world from September to February. Life is good. We've got a lot to build. And then March comes and suddenly, oh my gosh. So
everything changes. I was recalling recently that March 4th of this year, I returned to Boston from a trip to London, where I was there for a couple of days for some meetings with our team there. It was the last time I was on an airplane, the last time I left my home in Boston, and it was a lifetime ago.
It was a lifetime ago, and gosh, so let's start first with, so you get there September 2019. What was your mandate?
So the mandate really came in a few parts. First was create a brand. Obviously, nobody had heard of Acoustic, and we needed to position it in the marketplace. Second was build a marketing organization. There were a handful, and by handful I mean under a dozen people that had come along with the carve-out that were marketing people who had been part of IBM, but there was no marketing leader. And they'd all been sort of plucked from different parts of IBM Watson Marketing, which didn't mean that they'd ever actually worked together. And a third thing was really contribute as an executive team member to building a company. It's that's one of the hardest things that I've ever had to do, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. So build a brand, build a marketing organization, build a company. There's probably 28 sub-bullets under all of those.
But, and just a small mandate, because any one of those could be all consuming, but to have to do all three at the same time is substantial. I also want to just make sure that folks understand the scale. We're talking about a brand new company that has over 1,000 employees. This is not
that is correct.
So suddenly you're a startup, essentially, with 1,000 people, and this sort of history legacy of the way IBM did things. And I'm wondering if it makes sense to start with the third thing first, because to me, you suddenly had to build a culture. You had to build something that was distinct from IBM. You didn't have their resources. You didn't, and probably didn't want them either. I mean, you really had to build something new.
Yes, I think it's a great place to start, actually, to start with building a company, building a culture, because as you described, when the carve-out happened, it was over 1,000 employees, 3,500 plus customers, operating in 21 countries, and 5 major products that were all sort of packaged together. Here you go. Here's a brand new company born. Now, what's interesting about this, Drew, is that the bulk of those employees were not actually Acoustic employees at that point in time. We could spend forever talking about how these deals get structured, but if Acoustic was born on July 1, there were no systems, there's no infrastructure, right? A company can't run without Salesforce and ADP and NetSuite and Coupa and Microsoft Office, you name it, right? So the way it was structured was that there was a window in which we had to implement all of our infrastructure so that the bulk of the employees could end up becoming officially Acoustic employees. So for many, many months, in fact, from July all the way through, for most employees until April 1st of 2020, they were actually IBM employees working on behalf of Acoustic.
Wow.
Very sort of legally well-structured.
So
complex in the doing.
Yeah. And so what role did you play, and why? Because you have a lot of things to do. We had those 3 things. What role did you play in the development of, we'll call it, the culture and the company, and why?
Yeah, so interestingly, on the day that I started in September of last year was the same day that our brand new CHRO started. So we brought on a head of marketing and a head of human resources. We both started on the same day. She and I have become great colleagues, good friends, and turns out that we were both looking at this through the lens of companies, cultures, brands are born with people. And if we don't figure out a pathway to not only help them understand the culture we want to build, help them transition into that culture. And this was all before the pandemic, by the way, right?
Right. Yeah,
Help them
exactly.
become part of something. How could we ever go to market? How could we ever attract and hire? And I've found from my own personal experience, previous company and certainly here, that marketing needs to be actively engaged with the human resources function in terms of helping with messaging, recruiting, onboarding, right? Because building a brand starts on day one with an employee. In fact, starts before day one, the first time they find out about a company and they recruit it. So our head of HR, Rose, and myself, we sort of partnered up and we were very engaged in, okay, let's make sure we're going to define the vision, mission, values for the company. We're going to figure out how we establish a cadence of communication for the company. What are the channels in which we communicate? How do we talk with each other? And some of those things were in place from the original team that were carved out, but they didn't have a marketing leader and they didn't have an HR leader. And we brought extensive operational experience to the table, and we knew we had a partner, and we did right from the start.
It's so interesting. And, the other part of it, the advantage, you had no IBM baggage. You didn't have any sort of, this is what we had to be, or this is what we were. You actually had a really unique, clean slate opportunity to build a productive culture and brand, which is so kind of cool, actually. What were there any things that, where you said, okay, this really helps from an employer brand standpoint, in the purpose, mission, vision, in that stuff, which I tend to obsess about.
Mm-hmm.
What that really helped you and your HR partner think about the brand?
There were a lot of things that were built into that. One of the things that was key, and I want to give full credit to the team that was there before I got there that helped create the company name and the sort of overall approach to the company, because they did really fabulous work to sort of lay a foundation. And one of the things that's important is to think about the company name, Acoustic. It really comes from from the science of sound, and we think from the art of listening. And so from day one, the company was born with a belief that we needed to listen. We needed to listen to the market. We needed to listen to our customers. And that was going to be deeply embedded in who we are as a company. And so from that, there's a lot you can do to springboard into, oh, here's a way to approach who we are and how we operate and how do we listen each day.
It's such an interesting thing. So my dad was episode 100 of Renegade Thinkers Unite, and he is famous for being a good listener. And he really talked about that on the show, of just how much more interesting life was because of that. But my sense on listening is it is a skill that you can teach and you can get better at. And I'm curious, to build a company around that is a fascinating choice.
Yes.
How do you make listening, because it's sort of, people are either naturally good listeners or they are just talkers, but how do you build on that idea?
It's definitely a challenge. And I think one of the ways in which you need to think about it, Drew, is it's not just listening, but it's also to whom are you listening? And because just listening, well, you'll hear all sorts of stuff. The cacophony of life that surrounds us, and that's the world we live in. But if you're listening to your customers, right, it changes your orientation very quickly, and you do things in a very different way. If you're listening to your partners, if you're listening to your employees, right, each of those things causes a series of behaviors, actions, perspective that you say, oh, okay, if I'm listening to my customers, how do I reorient everything so that we start from the perspective of what they need? If I'm listening to my employees, how do we create forums for them to speak to us rather than us just speak to them? And each of those types of engagements form listening as the foundation of, okay, what's my next step? How do I do the right thing for a customer? How do I help make the brand a little bit better? How do I just even write a piece of copy if I'm creating marketing copy that starts with the notion of who's the audience, what am I listening to, and how am I open and expansive in what I want to hear?
Nice. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to dive into some specific things that you can think about as you look to build your culture and how that leads to brand. So stay with us. So, several thoughts as I'm listening to what you're saying went to mind. Is the important one was, to whom do you listen? Right, because there is no shortage of noise in the marketplace, and in any perspective right now. And there are also those who sort of, the classic Henry Ford. If I listened to the people, they would ask for a faster horse. So you
Right.
really I almost used lens, wrong metaphor. The ear that you listen with is important in all of this. All right. But what I like is, it's a perspective. It explains the name, which is an important place to start. It gives you something to build on, and it's a pretty powerful idea in and of
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah.
So what were some of the concrete things that you and your HR partner did to help establish this, we'll call it an employer brand for lack of a better term? Any concrete programs that you executed? And I'm thinking about things before COVID now.
Yes, before COVID. Well, and that's sort of interesting in that um, early on, as we start to build out the vision, mission, values, and we try to figure out how we're getting engaged with people, we also realized that one of the things we wanted to do, and we did very quickly, is we created an ambassador program with our employees. And when you have a large organization with lots of different levels and people who come out of IBM, so they had traditional reporting structures, and you're trying to meld it all together, you really need to have a set of employees at all levels that you can trust to be eyes and ears and a voice. And so we established the ambassador program, and also keep in mind, even before we went into lockdown, the company was geographically fairly dispersed. IBM had a fairly liberal, widespread work at home policy for its employees. And so we had lots of employees that were already working at home. That will be a good thing later on when we talk about going into lockdown. So we established this ambassador program. We had an application process. We recruited these ambassadors so that they could become part of the process to help. At first, it was really to help transition employees, because going back to the discussion we had just a few minutes ago, all those employees who are still IBM employees would soon become Acoustic employees. For many of them, they've been IBM employees for a long time. Right. They were used to a certain way of doing things. And Acoustic was not IBM. IBM is a 100-plus-year-old company with 400,000 employees. Acoustic is a year-old company with 1,000 employees. So we had to make sure that transition, whether it be as simple a transition as how to stop using Lotus Notes and learn how to use Outlook, or how to manage a 401k plan, or what happens to their mobile phone. These are all these examples of serious things that matter to employees. So we wanted to be able to help guide employees through the transition and get them onboarded so that they could become Acoustic employees.
Yeah, interesting. So was there any helping them in this? All of this is really helpful. What percentage of employees, or of the 1,000, were you hoping to have as ambassadors? Just give us a sense of scale.
Yeah, I think our initial goal was to have probably about 80 ambassadors.
Okay.
Total.
So, well, that almost covers probably most of the company and most of the departments. So
and different concentrations in different groups, obviously.
And did you, was there any plan of ultimately that these ambassadors would be more than internal ambassadors, but they would also end up being sort of brand ambassadors and become, promotions to help promote the brand externally?
Great question. And actually, the answer is no. We really wanted them to be focused on internal.
Got it.
We definitely want to figure out ways to get every employee to become a brand ambassador.
Right.
And that's an ongoing part of the program, is like, it's okay to post things on social media. We had to encourage employees to learn how to do that. But we really wanted these ambassadors to focus in on being that connection for all the other employees.
Okay. So that's part one. And, that was one of the three parts of your, one of three of the mandate. The other two, as I will remind myself, was to build a marketing team and
Yep.
then create a brand. I'm going to skip building a marketing team for the moment. We might be able to come back to it, but let's just talk about the process of from September 19 to March 2020. Give us a really snapshot of the process that you went through to sort of help bring this brand to market.
Yeah, for sure. And the thing that I sort of dropped into when I got there in September was a lot of activity that had already been planned that was introducing the brand primarily to existing customers. And I want to emphasize this point because as marketers, we sometimes forget that we have to make sure our brand is as relevant to our existing customers as it is to our prospects. And in this particular case, for all those customers, they've been IBM customers. So you can imagine a good deal of concern on their part over, oh, wait, IBM's selling this thing off, and now it's this company I've never heard of, and how do I trust them? What are they going to do for me? So a lot of the initial efforts were really creating a sense of comfort in the existing customer base over Acoustic is real, it's a real company, it's a real brand, we're going to support you, we're going to deliver new value to you, we're going to meet your needs. And that's sort of what I walked into. And there wasn't a lot of thought towards an external start to build brand awareness, brand perception in the broader market. And that's where I sort of picked up the baton when I came in with okay, now we also have to do that as well.
What's so interesting there to me on several levels. One is knowing that a lot of the companies chose these services really because they were connected to IBM, and there was a great comfort in the old saying, "No one ever got fired for hiring." It's IBM is still valid somehow. There is this overarching brand name that you're probably not making a mistake, but so that's part one of this thing, and part two of it is one of those most interesting post-COVID or pandemic reactions. The companies that have been successful in this period have gone back to their customers and really hunkered down and done renewals and all sorts of interesting things. And you had to do that in advance. You actually, in many ways, you had to go to your customers and say, hey, same stuff you liked, only better. And that's the interesting part, right? And that creates some interesting challenges from a brand standpoint, because you have to reassure them that still the company that you wanted to do business with, but somehow or other you're going to be better now that you're independent and you're 1,000 instead of 400,000. That's a really tricky tightrope to walk. I'm curious.
It is not only a tricky tightrope. I'm going to actually tell you that it's more. It's actually a tricky piece of very fine filament thread because of the following.
Yes.
It's not only were the customers of IBM, many of them had been customers of the companies IBM had acquired that became IBM Watson Marketing. So in many cases, you had to go back to the original cool startup that somebody had become a customer of, that had been a customer of, that had been acquired by IBM. And then during however long they were within IBM, maybe that customer was happy, maybe they weren't.
Right. Okay.
And then it gets carved out. And now we're Acoustic. We're not IBM. We're not the brands, previous companies like Silverpop and Tea Leaf and Core Metrics that had been the sort of foundation of the technologies. So I almost had to determine, conceptually, am I speaking to somebody who really was attached to IBM, or really was attached to the original thing, or wasn't attached at all because they had said, oh, okay, we'll buy this, and we ended up with this. It was a tricky thing.
Oh my gosh! And it really, again, we go back to the original part of this conversation, which was how does brand matter? So you're saying that there were Silver Pop customers who came in as Silver Pop, who appreciated whatever it had, its secret sauce, that hung on. We might even say, despite the acquisition
Mm-hmm.
of being acquired by, and they were loyal to Silver Pop.
Yep.
Uh, so and that's just an ephemeral brand idea, right? That's not necessarily and tea leaf and the okay. So what was how do we bring these pieces together then?
How do we make this all work? And it's been and
Yeah.
still ignoring the pandemic. How do we make all these pieces work? I've actually been through some similar situations because I've been in other businesses where we acquired assets that brought a brand with them, and we had to make a decision: do we keep the brand, not keep the brand? And I happen to come from a perspective that is, honestly, I have finite resources. I can only do a small number of things really well, and I'm going to double down on the brand that I have, and that in this case is Acoustic. And we're going to have to find ways at a macro level to build that Acoustic brand, and I can talk about that. And then at a more micro level, with each individual customer, we do have to engage with them, and we have a great customer service organization. We have to engage with them and help them see the value of coming from where they were through IBM to here. Why is there value? And part of that is in the fact that we're rebuilding all the products. So we've replatformed all the products. We've modernized them. So we've created what now is, we think, perhaps the most sort of modern cloud-based MarTech stack out there. But we had to help customers understand the value back to them. And I saw it through the lens of, okay, I could spend forever trying to explain how we got from this company, Silverpop, to IBM. No, I'm not going to do that.
Right.
I'm going to focus on Acoustic. We're going to deliver value in market. And so I began working with my team and with my agency partners to start to tell a story to the market about who Acoustic was. And we did a bunch of planning. We've all been through the process: test ideas, do strategy, build some concepts, then start to go to market. And lo and behold, my brand campaign launched on March 16th of 2020.
March 16th, 2020. And it's just not a random thing that you would forget that date. I think our company went into lockdown. I remember this very well. Facebook went into lockdown on the 7th because I got word on that. And the next week we were out of our office. So, okay. So you launched the new brand and talk a little bit about the brand, the essence of the brand and the story that you were telling with the brand on the 16th.
Yeah, and really our story has been very high level first, because I knew that I just had to start to get the name out there. And we wanted to really focus in on the notion that we were reimagining marketing technology. And everything about it was going to be somewhat different than the other MarTech companies. And if you follow the MarTech space, we all know there's a chart that has 8,000 companies on it. And whether you believe that all 8,000 of them are of equal weight and value is irrelevant to the fact that there's 8,000 companies. How are you going to stand out in that crowded market space? And so we wanted to start telling a story. We knew who our key competitors were, and we wanted to tell a story that was different. And one of the things that made us different, going back to the discussions we've had, when you sort of say, well, what's going to be better about Acoustic than was better about IBM than was Silverpop? Well, one of the things about Acoustic is we're 1,000 people just focused on this set of marketing technology, on campaign automation, on experience analytics, journey analytics, personalization, content management. So we're not trying to do everything. We're not trying to be a back office, solve every IT problem for a company. We're trying to solve problems for the marketers, for marketing, for the e-commerce folks. We're trying to be very focused And I think that's a great advantage. And that's part of our story in the market is, hey, we're not those other folks. We're Acoustic. We're rethinking the whole problem of marketing technology.
And one of the things I did notice on the website is that there's still the formerly IBM Watson Cloud Marketing there. How long do you think you need that there as a somewhat of as a reassurance? Oh, okay, I get it, right? How long does that stay part of this?
Yeah, so smart minds know that it's not just a little bit of reassurance; it's also a little bit of SEO. So you sort of have to play all the cards around that. And when you look at the website, you're like, oh well, they've been around since July of last year. Do they still need this? Well, turned out that the IBM website itself really didn't transition until early in 2020. Like they still had a website that was redirecting people, still redirecting people our site. So the short answer to your question is for a little while longer, we're actually actively building a whole new website right now, a complete brand new experience that I think will be when we can leave behind most of that. Here's everybody we used to be, and here's who we really are. And so when we launch that at some point in the future, it will be I think a good clean break from that. Now, our field people is an important point. Like when it comes sitting down and talking to somebody and they say, oh, you were this, that, and the other. Of course, we want to be direct, clear, and honest and say, yeah, here's how we got from there to here, and here's why it's actually good.
And for the listeners who were, you may remember an episode going way back with Jennifer Renault, where we talked about two specific experiences that she had where the acquiring company abandoned the brand name. One of them was Oracle, who abandoned Eloqua briefly.
Yes, that's right.
And there was another big technology company that had sort of was a spin out of private equity, and they were $4 billion company. They created a new brand name and they got rid of all their billion-dollar brands, and business sank and SEO really sank. And so I think the lesson here is, yes, you want to focus. There's no doubt you have to build the Acoustic brand, but all of that equity that existed before in IBM Watson Marketing or whatever it was, to walk away from that is a very expensive thing. And it's not a rip the Band-Aid thing. You do not want to have that experience, because here's the interesting proof of that. In both cases, in Jennifer's experience, and now she was talking about both of those after she'd left both companies, was that when they turned the website back on with those original brand name, business went back up. Mm-hmm. So there was latent demand and loyalty to those brands. And I imagine that you probably have the same thing, even with some of the other, like Silverpop. You probably still have to make sure that people who type in Silverpop can find you. And that's not going to
go. Exactly. And we spend a lot of time trying to find the right mix of that. I think the more interesting point in what you just said, Drew, is this notion of brand equity and brand value. And I think for people who love a brand loyalists, they only see the positive value in brands and brand equity. I think for marketers, those of us who have to manage a portfolio of brands, it's more like that equity is a commodity that has both pluses and minuses. And you have to figure out how to build an equation that takes into consideration, yes, this legacy brand has some plus, but if I'm not building my new brand and where I want to go, it has some minuses for me. And you have to figure out, yes, the brand's well known amongst the existing customers, but not amongst others. And so you start to put all those puts and takes together, and you create a little bit of a, for lack of a better word, a calculus of, okay, here's how I'm going to manage these legacy brands and their equity, and I'm going to get the maximum value that I can from them. At the same time, I may be trying to sunset them, and here's how I'm going to build my new sort of master brands and make sure that it's getting the most weight over the longer term.
Right. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come to what'd you do post pandemic or during the middle of the pandemic. Okay, stay with us. Okay, we're back, and this is gonna be a short segment, but interesting. One of the big challenges that companies face often after an acquisition is what to do with the brand names, and I think from a B2B standpoint, and IBM certainly are really good at this, is being a branded house is really pretty much a dominant option right now. Even Adobe, who acquired Magento and Marketo in the same 6-month period, $4 billion acquisitions each, sees themselves as a branded house, which I find fascinating. But they're managing the transition very carefully. You'll notice that it's Marketo, an Adobe company, or Magento, an Adobe company, or
They're back to, as we spoke about, managing the sort of pluses and minuses of the brands in your portfolio.
Yeah, and I think some of it has to do with the passion that people have for the brand. There's some brands that people don't care about, don't miss, and you can just walk away from them because it's a very transactional relationship. But it's interesting when in marketing technology, people like really they were eloquens, they were Marketo had a super fan name for it. These were people who were trained on it, were certified. They really appreciate it. And I'm imagining there was a community of Silver Pop people, at least, who had that. All right.
And tea leaf people, we have a large community of people whose business card literally says tea leaf engineer.
There you go.
Right? That builds loyalty, right?
It does, and it's part of their personal identity. I mean, they built their career on it, and this is the stuff that is really tricky in what it is you do. All right, so pandemic hits. How did that impact the last 6 months?
Wow, how didn't it impact the last 6 months is the question. But the way in which there was some good, as I mentioned earlier. A lot of the folks who come out of IBM were already working at home. So we actually had a super smooth transition to work at home for many employees. That was a good thing. Many of the others just sort of went to work at home, and that worked out okay as well. I personally didn't have to commute to New York because I'd been going back and forth to New York at that point in time. So it made it a little easier. But what's interesting is, and I want to be super careful in how I talk about this, because obviously, the pandemic has caused great distress across the globe and is not done yet, and we don't know where we're going to be. It's something that has a very serious impact on social, business, every person. At the same time, I think that we've become more efficient in some ways. We've become more focused, and although we've lost the ability to have that human connection of live people one-to-one, I do feel that everyone in the company has worked hard to be focused and be able to operate with these new rules. And getting back to the listening, as we try to do, one of the things that we started very early on in the getting ready for transition and then having to go into work at home was we created, myself and our head of HR, we created an online forum. At that time, once a week meeting for all of our employees, happened twice because we had employees around the globe. That was an opportunity for a discussion, a dialogue. It wasn't another just all hands. Let me tell you what we're going to do. It was a dialogue. And we continue that to today. In fact, I'll be running one in just about an hour from now. We call it One Acoustic Live. And what it is an opportunity for employees to come together. I serve as a sort of moderator, host. Our head of HR serves as my co-host. And we bring topics up and we have discussion and dialogue so that we can get the most out of people being online around the globe.
Interesting. So as I think about this, so I've been pushing this on the show for, couple hundred episodes, but if as a building a brand starts with employees, you went through that process, then it gets to customers, they have to buy in, they have to believe in the brand and the company. And then you can take this story out to the to the world. But you can't, and what's so interesting about what you've gone through is you had to do those things. But what I'm telling the listener is you have to do it too, even though you think you don't, even though you think, I got to focus on acquisition right now. I'm going to argue that now is more than ever, you have to focus on employees first and make sure that they understand the brand. Then make sure that your customers, because if they don't stay with you, you don't have a business right now, right? We've got to hold on to every customer we have and try to, the business that are growing, a lot of them are able to get their customers to say, use their product better than they were before in a way that really addresses the challenges of the business environment, which right now is help me find a way to save money or drive revenue. Okay,
Absolutely.
so I question for you is, what are the biggest lessons learned for you as you've taken this non-existent brand? You've now had a year. I mean, I'm sure we're way away from everybody in the marketing world knowing that Acoustic is the former IBM, but what are the biggest lessons you've learned?
And first of all, hopefully all the listeners now know who Acoustic is. If not, please let me know and I will happily educate you on the value we bring as one of the largest independent marketing clouds out there. But plug aside, I think one of the key lessons I've learned is, and you just alluded to this, doing a brand building exercise, taking a brand to market and creating brand awareness actually has turned out to be the easiest part of my job. It's not easy. Let me be super clear. It's not an easy thing, but amongst all the things that I'm doing, it's the easiest part of the job because for professional marketers like ourselves, we sort of know the way in which we go about identifying, doing this and bringing it to market. It's all of the people. It's all of the things we don't expect. It's all of the historical issues we mentioned of, well, it wasn't just IBM, it was a brand before that, and there's a long history of that. And in our case, it was also building a company from scratch. Like for a long time on the demand side, well, I could get leads, but I didn't even have anywhere to put them because we didn't even have our CRM system implemented initially. And then our CRM system connected to our own campaign automation system. We had to build everything from scratch. So you can't say, oh, I can tell you what my demand generation is doing. Is like, I can tell you I'm handing leads off to our sellers, but I can't actually track that all the way through. And those are hard things to deal with. So the brand is like, yeah, let's do that. That's straightforward. That's a piece of cake.
That's funny. That's really interesting. And you have the double sort of challenge, if you will, as you have to be the best user of your own software. I mean, and that's the thing that I've always marveled about marketing tech companies. I mean, Marketo in the early days, I interviewed John Miller way back when, literally 7, 8, 9 years ago. And they were the best at dry inbound, they by far, and using their tool to sort of measure when someone was just about ready to buy. So, and then Eloqua was really good at it, and HubSpot's been really good at it. So it must have been a challenge too, is you got to be really good at using your own tools.
You absolutely have to, and we're still getting there. Honestly, it's a journey that we're on because we have to figure out how to take full advantage of not just what the tool does, but the fact that we've been improving the tool for over a year now, and that we're free of the constraints that may have been placed on the tools or the people at IBM. And we have a new go-to-market model that's different than the IBM go-to-market model. So how do we make the tools shine in that go-to-market model?
All right. Well, I know that our listeners have run out of their exercise program because they're not commuting anymore. So we're getting them on the stationary bike or on their run. So we're gonna bring this to a pause. But even though I have so many more questions, Norman, what a fascinating challenge that you have both have had and have ahead of you.
It is, and I appreciate that, Drew. That I like hard problems, so I sort of naturally gravitate towards challenges like this. But I think it's one that if we get it right, we'll not only have built an incredible brand, that will serve the market, but will also have gone through a process of transformation that I think is tremendously interesting and useful to not just myself, but all of the team as we move forward. Because you know what? The future is going to be built on transformation.
It is. Okay. All right. There you have it. That's a perfect quote to end the show. The future is going to be built on transformation. All right. To my listeners, thank you for staying with us. If you got value out of this episode, of course, immediately go to your favorite podcast channel and give us a 5-star rating, or the folks at Drift say, give us a 6-star rating. So yeah, 5-star rating would be awesome. Share the show with a friend. Now I get to read the closing notes. Renegade Thinkers Unite is written and directed by Drew Neiser. Hey, that's me. Audio production is by Sam Beck. The show notes are written by Melissa Caffrey. The music is by the amazing Byrne Twins, and the intro voiceover is Linda Cornelius. To find the transcripts of all episodes, suggest future guests, or learn more about quite possibly the best B2B marketing agency in New York City, visit renegade.com. And until next time, keep those renegade thinking caps on and strong.